Hi, everyone. I'm Robin Mercy. This is the second part of my Mycelial Network interviews that I'm conducting with some of my favorite people and businesses in the Canadian fungal community. And I'm super thrilled to be joined today by kind of a longtime friend and collaborator. This is Patrick Kooyman, and Patrick is the owner and operator at Blue Lotus Ethnobotanicals, which is, well, why don't you tell me a little bit about Blue Lotus, Patrick?
Sure, yeah. So Blue Lotus Ethnobotanicals, I run a herbal business in Nelson, British Columbia, primarily making herbal products, so tinctures and salves and infused oils and things like that, but also providing, one-on-one work with people to assess their health needs and create custom formulations and protocols for them. And, this business really grew out of a love of plants and a love of, utilizing a lot of our local wild plants as well as, plants that you can grow in your garden here, trying to work as much as possible with locally sourced herbs and fungi to create medicines for people. And then I also offer workshops and classes, herb walks and medicine making classes and things like this. So that's mostly what I'm doing.
It's really important, the connection to, I think, local plants and fungi. And I'd love to dig into it a little bit more as we go through this chat here. But the first thing I was kind of curious about, you mentioned straight up that the main thing that you're doing is tinctures. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the tincturing process and also ask why tinctures. And there are probably a few reasons for this. But I mean, they're going to be shelf stable. Obviously, it's a nice product that you can give to people. But in terms of the medicine, so maybe you can elaborate on this a bit more. But as I understand it, you're doing exclusively dual extract tinctures right now, which is both a water and an alcohol component mixed together. So can you
Yeah, I
explain
mean,
about the tincturing process and why that specific dual extract process you find is a good way to deliver the medicine?
for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's many different methods and variations on tincturing. A tincture in its most simple form is just an alcoholic extraction of an herb. Um, and then you can get into different methods of it. Really to create a good tincture, the first thing you have to do is understand a little bit about the chemistry of the herb or mushroom that you're extracting. Some chemical constituents, medicinal constituents of herbs really dissolve well in alcohol. Other ones don't dissolve that well in alcohol. There's other constituents that will dissolve a lot better in water. So these are our two solvents that we tend to work with mostly in herbalism is alcohol and water. Um, Tinctures are a nice form to have a medicine in because, like you say, the alcohol itself is preservative. It gives them a long shelf life. And so, from a practical point of view, as an herbalist, I can harvest a fresh herb or a fresh mushroom and extract it into an alcohol base. And that's going to be a medicine that's then prepared and ready for use at any time throughout the year when you don't necessarily have access to that fresh herbal or fungal material. And they're convenient too. It's a form that, you can have a little bottle with you. You can carry that around with you, and it's easy to get your daily 3 times a day dosages of herbs in that way. It's all ready to go for you. You don't have to, boil any herbs on the stove or even make a tea or anything like that. It's all just prepared for you. So I've really been a fan of doing dual extraction tinctures, which is where you actually extract the herbs twice, once with alcohol and once with hot water decoction or infusion. And the exact process is going to depend on the herb. So for some herbs, you might actually extract it with water first. This is the case with most of the mushrooms, and then do the alcohol extraction second. Other herbs, it's the other way. You do the alcohol extraction first and the water decoction second. And then at the end, what you do is you take those two different extracts of the herb and you combine them together. And the reason for doing the two separate extractions is that the alcohol and the water are actually each going to pull different medicinal constituents out of the herb or fungus, and you really get a broader range of medicinally active chemistry that way, more similar to what you get if you were actually consuming the whole herb. So from my point of view, plants and fungi provide us with these very complex mixtures of active chemicals. And the best medicine, in my opinion, is to try to capture the full range of what was present in that plant or fungus in the first place.
But at least how I understand it, especially if we're talking about fungi, it can actually go beyond the potency of, say, a fresh fruit body. No, I don't know how it is. I don't have as much of a knowledge of the chemistry of plants, but because fungi often have, chitin in their cell walls, often you're not necessarily getting the full medical spectrum just consuming like fresh fruit bodies. Isn't that correct? So with the water and alcohol, you're actually getting things, whereas if you just picked up a mushroom and ate it, not all of those constituents would be bioavailable.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big thing, especially with, mushrooms in general, and particularly the polypore mushrooms, which are a lot of our medicinal mushrooms. They're very tough and woody. And so there's a few things going on. So with these kind of mushrooms, I always do the water decoction. So a long, slow simmering in water. It'll be something like 3 times for 8 hours decoctions in water. And the reason for this is that first of all, it makes the mushrooms safer to consume. There are some cases where raw mushrooms can potentially cause a little sickness or be toxic. So it's generally recommended to always cook your mushrooms. It's not necessarily something you want to eat raw in the first place. And then, like you say, the structure of the mushroom contains a lot of chitin and these very hard, indigestible substances in them. So decocting those mushrooms in water really helps to break down that structure and actually release a lot of medicine into the water. And then specifically with the medicinal mushrooms, all the medicinal mushrooms contain these beta-glucan polysaccharide molecules. These are long, complex sugars, and they extract really well in hot water. They really are highly soluble in hot water. And when you look at the way these mushrooms have traditionally been used, the traditional preparation has always been a decoction. This is the way that people have been consuming these mushrooms for thousands and thousands of years. And so, there's something there about respecting the history of use, and that people over time have figured out the best way to extract different herbs and fungi. So that's why we really like to do the water decoction first. And then having done that, in some medicinal mushrooms, there's other constituents that are not very soluble in water, but they're highly soluble in alcohol. And so having done the boiling process first, we've really helped to break down that fungal cellular structure. And then afterwards, when you put the alcohol onto them, it is actually really able to penetrate into the mushroom and pull out more of those other medicinal constituents that we're looking for. And then at the end, like I said, we're going to take those 2 extracts, combine them back at the right ratios to keep all the medicinal chemistry happy and in solution together.
Mm-hmm. I know just from talking to you about this over the years, there's really a lot that goes into it, and a lot of thought, not just in the process, but also in the herbs and fungi that you're selecting. So I imagine out there's just a huge range, really wide gamut of different medicines you could be using. When you're looking at either just doing a single herb or a mushroom tincture, or maybe even more complicatedly, a blend, what are some things that you're looking for? Are you looking for kind of a broad range of medicinal constituents? Are you looking for something that's locally available, something that you think would be of use to a wide number of end users, or what kind of makes something tincture worthy?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because really you can tincture almost anything. Maybe there's a handful of herbs that really are not the most appropriate to tincture, but in general, you could literally tincture almost any herb or fungus out there. For me, what I'm really looking for, first of all, I want to get as close to the source of that herb as possible. My belief is that the plants and fungi that grow in your local bioregion are in many ways the best medicines for someone living in that bioregion, because those are the plants and fungi that really know, the environmental challenges and just the environment that you live in. But also, you know, ideally, I want to either harvest the herbs myself or get them direct from the grower and as fresh as possible. The freshness of herbs makes a big difference. And we know that almost all herbs and fungi will degrade in quality the longer they've been stored and dried. So, with a lot of commercially sourced herbs, you don't necessarily know how long it's been sitting on a shelf in a warehouse, how the herb was handled and processed and stored the whole way along. And when you go to the big commercial herb suppliers, you'll see that the herbs are coming literally from all over the world. You might be tincturing something super simple like nettle leaf, which does actually grow locally here. But if you go and buy it from a herb house, maybe it's coming from Eastern Europe. So there's some carbon footprint issues there to think about as well, and also just how fresh, how good quality is that herb that you're getting. So I really like working directly with the herb growers or the mushroom growers like yourself, because I can talk to you. It can be like, okay, what is your process? What kinds of substrate are you using? And then with you, Robin, I've always been really stoked because literally I'll just get a 10-pound box of fresh lion's mane for tincturing, and I know that it was harvested within probably a 12-hour window of when I'm receiving it. And so that's really, the best quality and also locally sourced that's available to me right now.
Yeah, well, cheers. I appreciate that. And this kind of leads into a little bit as you're talking about sourcing primarily local ingredients, which I really support and think is valuable. I notice, I'm not in the same position as you with specific herbal knowledge, but I have been teaching mushroom foraging classes and workshops for the last number of years. And at least from my perspective, the interest in that world has really exploded. It seems, and it might be just kind of a microcosm of where we are here in the Kootenays, but I feel like even in the broader world, there's really a renewed interest in foraging, wildcrafting. And I know with that definitely comes some issues of ethics, and also sometimes, especially I'd imagine in the herb world, as well as in the edible mushrooms or not so edible mushrooms world, issues of safety. So is there anything that aspiring foragers, herbalists, medicine makers should be aware of, either in terms of sustainable harvesting or basic safety or preparation methods?
Yeah, there's so much we could unpack there. But first of all, I'd say if you're going to be getting into harvesting any wild plants or wild mushrooms for food or medicine, first of all, go out and get the best field guidebooks for your area that are available. You never want to consume any plant or fungus from the wild without being 100% certain of its identity. Just really make sure you have a firm species ID for that plant or fungus before you choose to, engage with it at all. There's so many issues around, what is the amount of a plant or a fungus that we can harvest from the environment while having a minimal impact. And I think this is a very important thing if you're working with any kind of wild plants or fungi to always keep in mind. But also be aware that, your herbs that you buy from a big herb supplier or your medicinal mushrooms from a big supplier, all of these things still have an impact on the environment. Whether our herbs or fungi come from cultivated sources or from the wild, in either case, there's an environmental impact. So, think about, where do your herbs and mushrooms come from? How much resources did it take to get them to you? And when you're wanting to start engaging with something in the wild, if you have the chance to go out with an experienced mushroom forager or herb harvester, and learn directly from them, the proper practices around harvesting and proper identification methods. That's really, in my opinion, the best way to really learn it is through that experiential learning. So definitely engage with local teachers in your community. But sort of some general things that I like to keep in mind when I'm harvesting anything from the wild. A lot of mushrooms, they're a fruiting body. They're like a reproductive structure that's releasing spores. And so as Robin is very familiar with, preaching to the choir here, the actual rest of the organism, the body, is actually the mycelium, which is in the ground or in the wood substrate that the mushroom is growing on. And so harvesting of wild mushrooms actually can often be done with minimal impact on the environment, and sometimes actually even a positive impact on the mushroom population. So when you pick a wild mushroom, it's almost like you're picking the apple off a fruit tree. And, the rest of the organism that produced that mushroom is still there. It can produce new fruiting bodies in future years or in future months. And then, of course, as a spore producing structure, mushrooms love nothing more than for you to pick them and then walk all around the forest with them, dropping spores the whole time. So in a way, mushrooms have actually evolved to attract all kinds of animals, including humans, to actually come and pick them. And there's a lot of research that shows that, the harvesting of culinary mushrooms or medicinal mushrooms to some extent in the forest doesn't actually have a negative impact on those populations, that they tend to still be present in the same amounts or even higher amounts over time by their interaction with humans. Of course, you always want to you don't want to go and pick the whole patch either. You want to always.
There's social reasons for that as well as environmental ones.
Well, and this is why mushroom pickers are always very, very reluctant to share their patches with you, because they know they can go and get a reasonable amount of mushrooms from that spot every year. But if like 10 other people find out about it, then maybe there won't be enough mushrooms to go around. You also want to be aware of, when you're picking wild plants or mushrooms, that you're not picking them near sites that have contaminated soil, contaminated water due to, industry or pollutants or things like that, because especially mushrooms and some plants will actually bioaccumulate toxins to higher levels than are found in the soil itself. So be aware of the land that you're harvesting from, and go back to places that you've harvested from in future years. Observe the plants and fungi. How are those populations doing in the wild? Are they thriving? Are they suffering? And adjust your harvest practices as you go.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all really good advice. There are a couple things that you said that I kind of want to pick up on and expand a little bit. I like the idea, as you were saying, and I'm kind of paraphrasing your sentiment here, but that it's not just about the things you should not do to avoid degrading an ecosystem or a supply of medicine. It can also be about positive, like net gain interactions you can have. And one thing that makes me kind of hopeful is, as people realize the value of the plants and beings within an ecosystem, that potentially gets folks more invested in its protection. And I imagine that's something that's definitely on your radar as well. I mean, a lot of these plants are foraged in somewhat threatened, potentially, ecosystems, whether that's old growth or sites of future development or whatever. Like, these plants need a place to live in as well. So I think one of the best things we can be as foragers or medicine makers is also activists, just in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the more, a huge thing in our society right now is that people feel disconnected from nature. We don't even necessarily think of ourselves as part of nature when really we are. And I think that, when people have a chance to go out into the forest or into the wild places and walk around in there, maybe harvest a little bit of a little food or medicine from that land if it feels appropriate, and then consume that and have that direct connection to nature. The more people do that, I think the more we intrinsically value those wild spaces and will work towards their protection, like you say. And, sort of shifting the paradigm too of not thinking of wild spaces as wasted space or just a source of resources for us to extract, but realize that we're actually part of this huge living system that we're all interconnected with, and that that those wild spaces are also places that we have a relationship with. So we have a relationship with the place, we have a relationship with the plants and the fungi that grow there, and there's a reciprocity there. So that ecosystem supports us, and at the same time, we should give something back in return.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. This is a little tangential, but you just made me think of just talking about not always taking very much from an ecosystem that you're interacting with. I think my favorite foraging experience this last year was just finding some patches of winter chanterelles near my place in Caslow, and literally being out there. They fruit quite late in the season, so this is probably November, cold rain bordering on snow, just out there for like hours and literally just picking like a tiny basket full. But it was just the most fun I had. It was just such an experience. Just something about the thrill of it. It was completely meaningless that I was, picking negligible amounts but yeah. Anyway, I had one other thing that I wanted to pick up on, just as you're talking about places specifically to pick from and how some plants and fungi can be, say, bioaccumulators of certain compounds. That just made me think, and this is something I had on my list to ask you anyway. There's got to be a lot of differences even within one species. Let's just choose, say, reishi mushrooms or something as an example. Depending on the health of the organism, what they're growing on, where they're growing, what season, the particular strain, there's got to be a lot of variability in the composition and thus the medicinal properties of that particular specimen. I don't know if there's a question here, but is that something you think about much? Like just yeah, and is there any real way, if you're say in the wildcrafting world, because there are ways you can do this kind of in a more controlled way in the cultivation world, but if you're out wildcrafting, is there any way to not just select against disease or contaminants, but select for healthy organisms that are going to be a good source of medicine?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things we can do. So first of all, accept that any wild plants or fungi are always going to be variable. Like you say, they vary their chemistry over the course of the growing season, depending on the local environmental conditions, whether they're being browsed on by foragers and things like that. So they're never going to be the exact same twice. But there's a lot of, most herbs or fungi have a particular harvest window or harvest season where their medicine will be the most strong at that time of year. So for instance, in general, root medicines we harvest in the fall, because that's when their medicinal constituents are at their strongest level. But interestingly, something like burdock, for instance, burdock root, which is a strong, potent medicine, but can also be used as food. For roots, a lot of ones that we'd harvest for food, we'd actually harvest in the spring, because at that point, the plant is mobilizing stored nutrients and converting them to simple sugars. And so burdock fruit harvested in the spring will taste sweeter. It'll be more nutritive. But if you harvest it in the fall, it's actually going to be a little more bitter and have a stronger medicinal property to it. So you can also just think about where is the plant or fungus directing its energy right now. Mm-hmm. So, in general, you'd harvest leaves in the spring when the plant is actively growing, because that's where it's putting its energy. Then you'd harvest, the flowers when it's in full flower. You'd harvest the roots in the spring or fall when it's most of the energy is actually being held in the roots. So there's a lot around harvest time. The other thing we do as herbalists to try to have at least some level of consistency or control over the quality and potency of medicine is to measure and weigh everything. So, when you're making a tincture, for instance, a standard fresh herb tincture is usually made at a 1-to-2 ratio, which means for every 1 gram of fresh herb, you add 2 milliliters of alcohol to it. And you're going to pick an alcohol that's at the exact right concentration to extract the medicinal compounds that are in that plant or fungus. So by doing everything at these sort of weight to volume ratios, measuring things, keeping track over time too of where we harvested herbs and how effective that medicine is, evaluating it also through the flavor and the scent. All these things are ways that we can get some idea of, the relative potency of the medicine from a wild source.
Fantastic. And what about stress to the organism? This is one thing that I was thinking of. I don't know how true it is across the board. You just hear about, for example, certain phytochemicals that might be developed by a plant, say, in response to some perceived threat, whether it's insects or bacterial or fungal or whatever. Are some of these defense compounds often useful medicinally for us as human consumers? Is there kind of a parallel there? And then is there something to a healthy organism being stressed that can be beneficial?
Absolutely. Yeah. As you say, a lot of these medicinally active constituents are at some level a defense chemical. So they help protect the plant or fungus, maybe against bacteria or viruses or other fungi that are attacking them, or maybe it protects them against browsing insects, or maybe they just taste bitter, and so that deters the larger animal browsers. And plants, as well as fungi, are known to very quickly, within a matter of hours, can start changing their chemical profile based on what kind of things are attacking them, and they can actually pass those messages through the mycelial network as well. So absolutely, plants that grow in extreme environments tend to have stronger medicinal qualities because they're actually are producing these secondary metabolites, these medicinal constituents, not for our benefit, but actually to help them thrive in the environment that they grow in. An excellent example of this is the herb yarrow. So, you can grow yarrow in your garden. And if you put yarrow in good garden soil with lots of water, the plants get huge. They'll grow 4 feet tall. But when you taste them, they're not very strong medicinally. When they're growing in these kind of pampered garden conditions, they actually lose a lot of their medicinal qualities. On the other hand, if you pick yarrow off of a hot, rocky outcropping in the wild where the plants are just like baking in the sun all day, inconsistent water, heavy snow load in the winter, very difficult, challenging environmental conditions, that yarrow is so strong as a medicine, and when you taste it, it's really bitter, really aromatic, with just indicators of that medicinal potency. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. I love that idea. And it is, I mean, we're quite a long way removed from especially plants in our evolutionary history, but it's interesting to think of it with the framework that maybe we have some pathogens in common, or at least different types of pathogens, and one compound developed by a different organism. Say, for an obvious example, like you were saying, like some kind of antibacterial compound that's going to be antibacterial, in different circumstances, and that might be something that we'd be looking for. So yeah, no, it's super interesting hearing all about that. So I wanted to close by just asking about some of your personal favorite plants and fungi to work with, either that you feel are useful for yourself, or you just like the energy of that organism, or you find it especially useful or helpful with your clients?
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's it's a hard one to
Yeah.
pick just a few favorites, Robin, but for sure, like reishi mushroom has always been a favorite of mine. I use it in formulas all the time. And the medicinal mushrooms in general, I use a lot just because they do have such a broad range of benefits, especially for a lot of the challenges that are faced in modern life. So, reishi in terms of, really, really supporting the immune system, helping to, as an adaptogen or a herb that modulates the stress response in the body. And then also, helping with a lot of, the diseases of civilization, the chronic degenerative conditions that people are dealing with. So I use medicinal mushrooms all the time in practice. I really like to work with adaptogens in general. So adaptogens is kind of a bit of an umbrella term for herbs, but it essentially means herbs that help balance the stress response in the body is really what they're doing. They're allowing us to adapt to stressful, rapidly changing situations. And if you think about the last couple years that we've all just gone through here, I think we probably all need a little bit of adaptogens in our life. So rhodiola root, that's another of my personal favorites. It's been a fantastic herb for myself, for as an adaptogen and for energy and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Other than that, I love anything that grows locally and wild, or also anything that you can actually grow in your garden, grow locally.
Yeah. This is kind of working backwards, but just the rhodiola made me think of it. You're originally, did you grow up in Alberta? Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up in Calgary. Yeah.
And
so
rhodiola is one that do we get it around here, or is it a prairie plant?
Well, so rhodiola, I'm working with primarily rhodiola rosea, which is actually I'm as a cultivated herb. It was a cultivar. It grows all across the boreal forest, different species of rhodiola. But the cultivated form that I'm working with was originally developed in Norway, and then our friend up in Barhead, Alberta, has been growing it up there. And then, it grows pretty easily from root divisions and things like this. So I've got a little bit of it going on in the garden. It's another herb that's kind of like yarrow, where the more extreme the environment that it grows in, the stronger the medicine. So it's really a herb that, in the wild, it grows in moist rock cracks high up in the mountains. So it's exposed to extreme temperatures and UV in the summer, and then extreme cold and snowpack in the winter.
Yeah.
And it's a really amazing herb. Yeah.
Those are some great examples. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. I don't want to take up too much of your time here, but it's been really fantastic chatting with you for a bit here. Where can people find you?
You can check us out on Instagram at Blue Lotus Ethnobotanicals, bluelotusethnobotanicals.com. Or if you find yourself in Nelson, BC, you can always look us up at the Nelson Farmers Market. Yeah. I appreciate this, Robin.
A shameless plug here. You can also find us at the time of this being published, all of Patrick's some of his mushroom tinctures will be available through my website as well, so mrmerciesmushrooms.com. If you're here already, just go over and check it out. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. I really appreciate chatting to you. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Robin. Have a good day.